All right, class. We're in the Crow now. This is the first major lecture. And what I want to talk about today is the horse metaphor that's in this thing. Also, you'll see that barbed wire is a major feature that occurs in the comic book. And it is symbolic of how Eric and Shelley, his fiancée that's raped and murdered, are captured, trapped by this whole pain of this situation. And the first major metaphor that we see is shattered in the head. Now, what we have here is, Eric having almost like a vision or a hallucination, which happens often. And he's in this train, he sees this beautiful white horse, and we think that the beautiful white horse at first is symbolic of Shelley, his fiancée. And because he makes eye contact with the horse, because he first sees and falls in love with Shelley, they're drawn together like the horse is drawn to the train. And then we see on the next page that the horse runs into the barbed wire. And if you'll notice, the panels go over the background. You can see the horse and the barbed wire in between the panels, meaning that it's important. It bleeds into every aspect of this comic book. The horse is caught in the barbed wire and, dies. And the Crow tells him, you shouldn't have looked. We have the conductor there as a skeleton, asking for tickets. And right now, as we see it, we assume that this is, a metaphor for Shelley. Because he fell in love with Shelley, she ends up dying. Okay. We see the barbed wire again. Sorry, let me find it. It's a little difficult because I'm sure that you've noticed these don't have page numbers, which is kind of annoying. But we see barbed wire again in this sequence. Right here. Runs through all the pages. And we have a poem. There's a man playing a violin, and the strings are the nerves of his own arm. A twisted soul, the mortar. Despair, the bricks. To build a temple to sadness. He ties a spent shell in his hair and says number one. Again, that barbed wire is in everything. Now, unless you finish the comic book, you don't realize it. But this little scene that pops in here is when Shelley, his fiancée, is raped and murdered in front of him, and he's been shot in the back of the head. There's a question of this comic book of whether or not Eric Draven is alive or dead. Like he's just crazy because he's been shot in the head. And that answer is revealed, in the comic. Now, hopefully you've read this comic before this lecture, so spoiler alert. If you haven't read this comic, too bad, you should have. Just kidding. But he is actually dead. He is completely undead. I mean, the Crow has brought him back. We don't know if the Crow is a representative of the Christian God or if the Crow is some other kind of supernatural representation of, or emissary or whatever, angel, whatever the Crow is. But the idea of the Christian God pops in several times throughout this. When the Crow first is revealed at the end of the book, when we get a flashback, when the Crow first is, comes, he comes in the shape of almost like a cross. Eric Draven himself carves a crown of thorns into his own chest. He references Jesus Christ many times throughout the book in the angel Gabriel. The white cat is called Gabriel. He holds his arms out as if he's on Christ on the cross, several times throughout this. He's almost... I had a student write an essay one time that stated that Eric Draven is almost an inversion of Christ, that whereas Christ chose to sacrifice himself for sinners in Christian religion to save us all, Eric version is actually the opposite of that. He was forced to die, and he comes back to save people, not all people, but to kill the people who are not innocent so that the people who are innocent in the city can be saved, or at least stand a chance. They both offer forgiveness. However, Eric Draven only forgives a couple of people. One guy who didn't really want to be involved in the whole gang life and had kids. He lets that guy live. So he forgives a couple people, but anyways. All right. So moving on with this metaphor of the horse and barbed wire. Barbed wire appears here or there throughout the comic book. Nothing too major. Again, until we reach, the kind of the crown of thorns, which looks like barbed wire carved into Eric Draven carves into his own chest. He's also known as the Crow. When we finally figure out what has happened to Shelley and Eric towards the end of the comic book, it's revealed that he is in fact undead. But one thing that's really interesting about the special edition version is when we get to the end of the comic book, we get this new section that wasn't in there before called Sparkle Horse. Now, what's interesting is James Zabar added this later, and if you read the note he has in the front of the book, he added many scenes later because he just didn't feel like he was ready to add them at the time, that he didn't have the talent and he didn't have the perspective. Now, what's interesting about Sparkle Horse is it changes the entire metaphor of what we thought was the white horse representing Shelley. We find out that horse doesn't actually represent Shelley, it represents Eric Draven. And in order for him to move on, for him to be reunited with Shelley after he's killed all the bad guys, he has to shoot this horse in the back of himself, in the head. And this horse is symbolic of him forgiving himself. Now, James O'Barr blamed himself for Shelley's death, that had he had more money and been able to afford insurance, that she would have been walking to her car to drive to pick him up and she would be alive. He blamed himself for Brandon Lee's death because he wrote this comic book. That's why Brandon Lee died in the filmmaking. He locked himself in his house for like months when Brandon Lee died. And it's not until he's able to forgive himself, which is revealed in this conversation, that he's actually free of this horse, this trapped in barbed wire, that the horse, dies when he shoots it in the head, that he's allowed to be reunited with Shelley, that he's allowed to ride the train to the afterlife with the skeleton conductor who's now like a sheriff. And then we get all the religious imagery in the end of the angels in the cemetery. He's reunited with Shelley, and he seems to finally have met peace. So that barbed wire metaphor is a main component in the book. And you also, like I said, you see it when he carves a crown of thorns into his chest, and it pops up over and over again. Very important.